briefly and probably in rather casual and cavalier fashion. Do you know the old Chinese saying, if you want to know what water is, the last thing to ask is a fish? It's an excellent place to consider the discussion of today's world in discipleship, because it reminds us that our discipleship is never in a vacuum, and its context is never neutral, and often the most deadly dangers are those which are subtle and therefore insidious. Or to put it in terms of the fish and water saying, to really appreciate our environment, we need to have a counter perspective or a counter environment to see what it is. And unless we do, we'll very often be surrounded, if not molded, by forces we're not aware of. Christianity should be characterized by social dualism. We're in the world, but not of the world. We're no longer what we were before we are Christians, but we're not yet what we will be when Christ comes again. And the church at its best should always be involved, but never identified. Committed to the world, but never compromised by the world. Or as the Hartford Appeal put it, we should be against the world for the world. And one of the questions that's being asked today, as one looks at what I called earlier, this disparity between our numbers, our wealth, our influence, and all that, and what we're doing, one of the key questions that's being asked is not just where are we lacking in Christian alternatives, thinking and acting Christianly, but where are we being molded by pressures in the culture around us of which we are not aware? Now, the whole issue of contextualization, which this involves, is absolutely key to two things. Contextualization is key on the positive side to mission. Unless we appreciate context, we cannot communicate. But on the negative side, contextualization is the key to worldliness. If we become too much one with that same context, then we compromise our commitment to Christ and become one with the world. In other words, both for the sake of faithfulness and for the sake of witness, there should always be a constant question in the church. What are the forces shaping the church, helpful, harmful, and what are they doing to it? And I think if you start to ask those questions today, you get some very interesting answers in terms of why we're not responding adequately to the contemporary crisis. The three normal approaches that I've seen in the Christian world are firstly to make an analysis through history of ideas. Philosophy, psychology, history, and all these things. In other words, to analyze the way ideas have infiltrated down, affecting the thinking of the church and made us more worldly than we're aware of. And that's key, and that's becoming popular today. The second way that's very common today is through cultural anthropology, an analysis of the customs and conventions and so on of families and tribes and nations. And this, again, is very valuable. The third way, and one which is perhaps the least used and I think today the most useful, is by analyzing social experience. Seeing the way our social location affects what passes for knowledge so that we're more molded by our social experience than we're aware of. Now, of course, all of these are important. And I don't think we should pick one as opposed to the other. But the first two are both better known, and they also have definite snags. For example, the history of ideas approach, while it's absolutely crucial, I'm not undermining it at all, and often take that approach, it's very difficult to translate down to the ordinary person's level. I'm sure many of you have heard people trying to explain how Kant and Hegel and Kierkegaard and people like this have affected the average Christian, and he's usually bemused or dazzled, and sometimes more dazzled than convinced, because there's that translation gap between the history of ideas and seeing it at sort of grassroots level. The problem with much of the cultural anthropological approach is that so much of it's more relevant to the third world than to the Western world. But the analysis of the third way of social experience fits the bill marvelously, because it really deals with what passes for knowledge on the everyday level, and it deals with it very much in terms of the modern, Western, progressive world. So I'm not saying we ignore the other two, far from it, but as another level of analysis of worldliness or the context which we need for communication, I think today one of the most interesting areas to explore is this whole question of the way Christian living has been affected by social experience in the world today. A couple of quick illustrations so you can see what I'm on about before we go any further. Take, say, time. Here's an example where you can see ordinary people have been affected by both ideas and social experience, but probably they're more aware of the social experience than the ideas. What's affected their view of time, their consciousness and mentality about time? Well, the scriptures, undoubtedly. Augustine, yes. Einstein, yes. And Whitehead and others, and so on. But how many of ordinary people, how many of us today, could say exactly how and where and why? Very few. But what has crucially affected modern experience of time? The social experience of living with clocks, watches, diaries, schedules, timetable, planning, management, all these things, where time through the social experience of things like clocks is written into our experience at all sorts of ordinary levels. Or take another example closer to the church. How do you interpret the drive-in church, say in Southern California? Is this the product of the history of ideas? Do you imagine some theologians discovered that Psalm whatever really in the Hebrew means praise God in the chariot, and so we build a place capable of it? In this case, I imagine we'd be very hard pushed to think of any idea in terms of the history of ideas that's had any influence at all on it. Well, what's caused it, or what's behind it, so it's easily interpreted? Well, simply leisure, convenience, and supremely mobility in cars. And where's it come? In Los Angeles, no accident. In other words, the social experience of living in Los Angeles is very heavily behind the whole thing that makes the drive-in church, and not a natural extension of the drive-in bank and the drive-in movie. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, that's irrelevant. But you can stick to what I'm saying. You can see, though, how the social experience is key in both cases. In the second case, even more key than the history of ideas. Well, that leaves us then with two great questions we've always got to ask in terms of this third approach of analysis. The first question is, what are the pressures in our modern experience which are affecting us as Christians or as religious people? What are the modern pressures which are crucially affecting us? The second question is this: what are the problems that these pressures are creating for Christian living, and through living for discipleship, for witnessing, every aspect of the Christian life? Now, these questions, of course, you could spend a long, long time analyzing them, and I do stress that everything I'm saying is very cavalier because of the shortness of time. And I'm afraid I forgot when I started, so I'm not sure when my half hour runs out. Pardon? No, but tell me when. I'd prefer to know. I started then? Okay. My watch says 10:45 now, alas. Okay. Let's take this first question. What are the pressures in modern experience that crucially bear down on religion in general and Christianity in particular? I'm working under a tutor at Oxford who's one of the leading sociologists of religion in the world. And he would be one with most sociologists in religion in identifying three particular pressures which are endemic to modern experience, which are crucial in bearing down on religion in general and Christianity in particular. The three are simply these. First, the process of secularization. Secondly, the process of pluralization. And thirdly, the process of privatization. All technical, if not jargon words. Get the idea and drop the word. Let's look at secularization first. That's the process by which religious ideas and institutions are losing their social significance in modern society. The ideas are becoming less meaningful, the institutions more marginal. And this is one of the features of modern society which is really radical. Now, of course, this is not universal. Of course, this is not uniform. All sorts of arguments and qualifications need to be made. But there is no doubt at all that as modern capitalist economy, modern bureaucracy, modern industrial technology, the modern mass media, all these things which are the carriers of modern consciousness come in, so there has been an inevitable tendency to some degree for the consciousness to be secularized. In other words, for there to be a removal of the sense of the reality of the supernatural, at least from some areas of life, and a reduction of consciousness and concentration to certain here and now realities, above all defined by functional reality. So the key prototypes in modern society are the engineer and the salesman. And you can see in those two functional rationality at its highest degree. Now, if you think back to what men were in the past, you can see how new this was. Human beings, Christian or non-Christian, have almost near universally had a sense of transcendence or the supernatural or religious, however they've interpreted it. Beings, forces, experiences which went beyond the here and now. So the ordinary reality was the basic world. It was the basic waking world, 7 to 11, and so on. But there was another reality, which was so important it called this reality in question and provided a transcendental frame of reference, so that things as basic as sex and business and government and kingship and so on were all interpreted within the religious framework. But today, under the impact of secularization, for many people, much of the time, ordinary reality is not only the official reality, it's become the only reality. As Peter Berger puts it, we live in a world without windows. Now, many of you know this whole question of secularization. There are a huge number of arguments, and we haven't time to go into them. The first big argument is over the definition of religion. If you define religion substantively in terms of a belief in gods or God or the supernatural, as soon as that disappears, you can say we're in a totally secular society. And incidentally, you might think Christians would support a substantive definition, but in fact they don't. They support the second, a functional definition, where religion operates by providing people overarching frameworks of meaning, so that even if there's nothing specifically religious in terms of a belief in God, gods, or the supernatural, there still are religions, if in secular guise, such as, say, Marxism or humanism. The first great discussion is over the definition. Which way you go depends on your outcome. The second great discussion centers around the explanation of secularization. Has it come from ideas such as naturalistic science, or the social experience of living with a machine synthetic world, and so on? The third great discussion is over the distribution of secularization. It's not universal. There is no totally modernized societies. Countries are either more modernized or less modernized, but there's no completely modern country, even America. So that, say, Alabama or Mississippi are a long way behind New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. So secularization is not universal, and nor is it uniform. It's come in different ways, different places, at different times, in different ways. For example, France in the 1940s, people pointed out that men were more secularized than women. People in the cities more than those in the country. Middle-aged people more than the young or the very old. People in industry much more than those in professions like law and medicine. Why? Well, in each case, the more secularized were those who were closest to the heart of the modern world. Bureaucracy, technology, mass media, and so on. And there were various insulation belts, either in middle-class values or in youth or old age or the country or whatever, which kept other people from really being secularized to that same degree. And yet there was the inevitable tendency to some secularization. The last huge discussion is over the diagnosis of the present stage of where we are today. In other words, by contrast with the 60s, the heavy secular optimism, today the explosion of repressed transcendence, the mysticism, the occult, the Eastern religions, the charismatic movement, and so on, right across the board. What does this represent? And there's a tremendous discussion over this. But there's no doubt that despite the differences in this huge debate, which is absolutely key to modern ideas, secularization is something that has to be dealt with very seriously in certain areas. The second process is much easier to understand, the process of pluralization. That's the process by which in modern society we're coming to have an accelerating number of options. Worlds, worldviews, hobbies, lifestyles, religions, you name it, we can choose it. It's all around us today. The image here might be of a supermarket, choice to the point of success, excess. This one is not radically new. But compared with the past, it's increasing at a rate which is unprecedented, and it's shattering much of the old sense of givenness, obligation, and stability. You can think of the factors which are increasing this: knowledge, economic prosperity, popular travel, mass media, urbanization. The very word urban is related to the word urbane because the man in the city knows there are many differences, great variety. Go to Telegraph Avenue, Berkeley, you're not fazed by 100 freaks in 100 yards because that's what city living is like. And you find them in Times Square or Piccadilly Circus or whatever. Urbanization has always increased the sense of the option, but the country person, his mind is blown when he sees this for the first time. So you can see dozens of factors all around us increasing pluralization, but here's the sting. The more choice, the more change, the less commitment, the less continuity. Put it in a very trivial illustration. If you're left your great-grandfather's silk handkerchief, you probably appreciate it and look after it. If you lose it, you look for it. Have any of you ever looked for a Kleenex? You see the difference in the relationship. The Kleenex is made disposable, and it is trivial. But pluralization means that our relationship on many much more serious levels is closer to the Kleenex model than it is to the silk handkerchief model. When it touches homes, it begins to cut in. You notice people today who either have a sense of lack of fulfillment by being relocated so often, and today more and more of top executives beginning to refuse. Why? The sort of crisis of identity that pluralization involves. Go higher still in terms of marriages, and it's far more destructive. And surely the marriage crisis is not just a crisis in moral values, that too. It's a crisis in pluralized relationships. It's unthinkable in fast, transient, mobile relationships that one man, one woman, without, say, the Christian values, can last for a lifetime. Of course, it's most crucial of all in terms of faith. And people today switch their convictions as easily as they switch channels in the television because of the options that pluralization offers us. And modern man has been described as conversion prone. The third key process is that of privatization. The process by which the modern world makes a cleavage between the private spheres of our life and the public sphere in the modern world. The public sphere is the world of the state, the bureaucracy, the labor unions, the corporation, etc. You just think of General Motors or ITT or the Pentagon. And there you have the public world and its modernized features. Anonymous in its character, rather alien in its inner workings, but not the place where individuals go to find themselves, to put it mildly. Not the place where they're encouraged to exercise their values freely, not at all. In contrast, the private world, the leisure time, the family, the church, the voluntary association, the hobby. In this world, a very different atmosphere. And in the modernized sector, one of the unintended consequences of modernization is this cleavage between the two, which is privatization. Now, the balance sheet, of course, is mixed. It's double-edged. There are good points, there are bad points. One of the greatest of the good points is that privatization represents amazing freedom. We can do what we like in the modern world, do our own thing, have our own beliefs, redecorate your psyche as often as you redecorate your living room. All is possible today in the modern world, in the private sphere. Compared with the past, amazing freedom. Compared with totalitarian countries, extraordinary freedom, and so on. So it does represent extraordinary freedom, and I'm not undenying that. Having said that, there are certain distinct snags, and if you see these, they relate to the problems that Christians have. The first snag is that privatization is limited and limiting. We can do whatever we like within that area, but not outside that area. So any identity, any value, but only in that area. So that the privatized world becomes a kind of innocuous play area where people can do their thing to their heart's content without upsetting the big economic apple carts of society. Another snag of the privatized world is that it's fragmented. The huge difference between the worlds means that there's freedom in each world, but a sort of sense of dislocation between them. People not only wear two hats today, they often have two worlds to live in today, and many of them even ethically have two souls today. And that dislocation and fragmentation, which so many different worlds means, is very damaging in a second way. A third snag is instability. The private world is both understructured and oversold, and is therefore amazingly free and fragile at the same time. It's understructured, the crisis of values, the loss of the extended family, etc. It's oversold because it's now the sphere not of production, but of consumption, of gratification, of finding ourselves, and so on. So all sorts of unrealistic appetites and unrealistic expectations are created in the private world, but very often the freedom breaks down very quickly and becomes fragile. Divorce strikes in, and the whole world's fallen apart because it was only too strong, and the children with them. Sickness comes, the job moves them, the neighborhood grows violent or whatever, and you can see many cases where this little free little world suddenly becomes very unstable and falls apart. A fourth key problem is its vulnerability. Because of what it represents of individual fulfillment, freedom, and gratification, it is very vulnerable to infiltration and manipulation from outside forces. For example, politics. The appeal of what we call in Europe today the quiet life vote relates to this. Privatized man's ultimate value is survival. Privatized man's immediate value is personal peace and prosperity. And the quiet life vote he's absolutely vulnerable to because of the way privatization means something to modern man. Second thing, of course, is Madison Avenue and commercial advertising. If his identity and his freedom depend on what he can consume in the private world, you have conspicuous consumption. Consumption which spells out identity and social status and nothing to do with need objectively. And so you see that privatized man is a sort of champion consumer in that way and very vulnerable to Madison Avenue. He's also vulnerable, of course, to the therapeutic agencies and to the religious cults. It's so difficult to keep apart the integrity, to keep together the integrity of his world. So when his identity crisis happens, or his marriage falls apart, or his family breaks down, he has to pull in the new therapeutic counseling. Just go to your bookstores. People have said that if you want to measure privatization, count the number of therapeutic counsel agencies you have in a local area, and you can see how heavily that area has been privatized. Because the privatized world needs that and is open to these things. And if they break down, finally, people are open to things ranging from the Maharishi up to Jonestown. The vulnerability of privatized man. Now, build up that picture of these powerful pressures, not as ideas, but as part of the experience of living in modern culture. And what you end up with is a tremendously challenging picture of a modern worldview which is much more than ideas, which is like a steel press bearing down on us, or like a boa constrictor threatening to constrict us in its coils. And the question is, what are the problems that that's creating for discipleship? Now, I could probably stop there and ask you to do the rest of the work. But if you start to take some of those key things and saying, how have they worked out on the church, you can see that many of our weaknesses, not all of course, many of our weaknesses are directly related to the constricting pressures of modern consciousness working out on discipleship, witnessing, and so on. If you had time, there'd be 3 areas you could valuably look into. I'll just mention them. The first would be to look at the way the church structures have been affected, the institutional damage. The second way would be to look at the way the substance of the very faith itself has been affected. And the third area would be to look at the way the church's stance towards modernity and wider culture has been affected. And in each case, you could see an embarrassing correlation between the pressures bearing down on us and the problems we're facing. And only by facing this will we really do something about it, because we've analyzed the problem accurately. Of course, this isn't the whole problem, it's an important component. Take, say, structures. If you look around modern society, you can make one broad comment about religion, including Christianity, that you see an exclusion from the center of society and a polarization towards 2 extremes. Christianity and most religions are almost totally excluded from the centers of modern society, where the hard economic and technological and scientific, etc., things go on. Christians are in there as private individuals, but they do not operate in terms of their Christian presuppositions and perspectives in terms of the overall ways industry, etc., works. The central areas of modern society are liberated territory with regard to religion. There's been almost an exclusion of religion and a polarization to these 2 extremes. Where do you find it? You find it in the most public areas, such as state legitimation, so that wars are declared now and God is brought in and so on, and families are bolstered up in the name of God, but it's largely rhetoric. There are exceptions like Jimmy Carter. But for most politicians, that's not the reason they've made the decisions, it's the rationalization in which they dress it up. So it's polarized to the most public areas, which is largely rhetoric, which means that religion in general and Christianity in particular is structurally alive and well only in one place, the most private areas of modern society. Now you could go on to that and examine the church's structures today in terms of privatization and come to some very realistic conclusions. That maybe 80 or 90% of modern conservative Christian structures are heavily privatized. Strangely, people think that the signs of the personal, the home groups, etc., are all signs of revival. I'm not denying the renewal. I'm saying the renewal is taking place in the context of privatization, and therefore is something which the Reformation would never have fallen for. Take, say, that limitation. The British Prime Minister, who was alive when Wilberforce was struggling against slavery, once heard Wilberforce and made the famous remark. He said this: "Things have come to a curious state of affairs if I'm expected to take Christianity seriously in my personal life." When it became personal, he was very threatened because of its social implications. A few years ago, Theodore Roszak, visiting the Californian churches, made the classic remark, "Today, Christianity is privately engaging but socially irrelevant." We've gone from the former situation to the present one where it is so personal it's quite innocuous. Why? A heavy privatization. So the overarching meaning which Christ's lordship once made, say for the Reformation, has become no bigger than for many people in practice than the size of an umbrella that they have in certain parts of their lives. Those total life norms which Christianity once was have become part-time values which are fabulous with the family, the personal, free time, leisure world, but have no relation to the big world of business and so on. And sociologists delight in pointing out that you have, say, a Christian father, prays with his kids, but goes to business and he prays for his colleagues, witnesses to his colleagues, doesn't fiddle his income tax returns, doesn't curse, etc., etc. But the limit of his involvement and obedience in the office is all personal and never gets down to the question, say, raised by the book of Amos or raised by the life of Wilberforce. He doesn't think Christianly and act Christianly about the whole sphere of influence in which his life moves. Why? The privatization of Christian structures. Again, you can see the same problems as in privatization generally. It's limited and it's limiting. It's unstable. These Christian groups which are boiled down to the nuclear family or the home group, cutting themselves off from church history, cutting themselves off from the wider worldwide community, they're so unstable. They're here today and gone tomorrow. Easy to join, easy to lose. Pick them up, throw them away. And there's an amazing volatility and fragility and so on about much of this new anti-institutional Christianity which is so heavily privatized. And of course, again, too, it's manipulable. Pulled by the power of the state, it very easily becomes civil religion. Pulled by the power of the market, it very easily becomes consumer religion. Pulled by the popular needs, it very easily becomes what's called today common religion. Pulled by the psychological vacuum in our culture, it very easily becomes closed religion. In other words, it swings from this total openness of the 60s to the increasing closure of the 70s. So whether it's some of the charismatic groups now becoming extremely authoritarian or people like Jim Jones having that same pattern in terms of his own relationship, you can see the privatized world is so vulnerable to these other pressures and very easily is manipulated and infiltrated. You could spell that out a lot more. Other things I won't go into. A third process you can see in terms of structures is the bureaucratization of the church. The counterpart on the higher level as privatization is on the average person level. A fourth key structural effect is the commercialization of the church. Its structures, styles of witnessing, the very substance of the gospel itself. Heavy commercialization of the church today. If you like, I'll spell this out in the discussion. But first of all, start to ask yourself, how has the church institutionally and structurally been affected? And it's embarrassing how close modern consciousness fits what we are now thinking is Christian. The second area is the whole way it's affected ideas and the substance of the faith. Let me just outline these in brief, and I think I'd be better just to wind this up and throw it open for discussion, be more interesting. But let me just say the areas you could think of. What you see first is a general loss of certainty. Secularism makes ideas less real. Pluralism makes religious ideas just one among many. Privatization makes religious ideas just seem to be a private preference. And so you can see first a general loss of certainty and a melting down of the faith. Analyze choruses, analyze testimonies. You can see this shift from the knowing words to the believing words to the feeling words, what R.C. Sproul calls the sensuous Christian of today. Secondly, you can see the loss of comprehensiveness and the general miniaturizing of the faith. Instead of the Lordship of Christ covering every area of our thinking, again, it's alive and well in the personal and the pietistic and so on, but not in these other areas. Again, sociologists who poke fun at this love to quote the example of the Southern evangelist. Take 10 sermons by an evangelist. Every time he says sin, say what's he referring to? And almost every time there'll be personal sins. Drinking, adultery, swearing, or whatever. And again, there'll be a far cry from the world of Amos or Wilberforce. Why? Because of the loss of the comprehensiveness of Christian ideas and truth and thinking, and the miniaturizing of the faith to the personal, interpersonal. Look at the publishing. Just go into a Christian bookstore and you can see what sort of things really sell. The third thing you see is this loss of the compelling power of truth and a general marketing of the faith. Creeping in, again, for all sorts of reasons I won't analyze. But in the very way the faith is referred to at the subtle and profound levels, it creeps in. Trivial levels. I was in California last summer, and after the end of every lecture I gave, the fellow who put them on came up at the end, even after I'd said that he was doing this, and he kept saying, "Boy, that was a great package." Typical of the way things are referred to today in terms of putting things over. At far more serious levels, I read recently an interview by Herman Kahn, and he was talking about Christianity, and he said, in America, we've had Jesus Christ under contract for a number of years, and I'm afraid we've grown tired of his product and changed our minds on him. Now you might ask, is Herman Kahn being blasphemous or perceptive? And as a European, amazed at the things that go on in terms of the marketing and commercialization of the faith, I'd say he's being incredibly perceptive, which of course crucially affects the presentation of the gospel and the preparation for discipleship. Much American evangelism that I've heard done is all invitation, no demand. All appeal and promise, and almost no costs and sacrifice. And you can see this reflected in the quality that's coming through. Under the impact of modernization, not only have ideas done their damage, but modern consciousness in these ways has crucially affected the very substance of the faith. The third quick thing, and I'll finish with that. Modern consciousness has crucially affected the church's stance in society. Now, this is an old problem, but the power of modernity is such that since about 1800, you've seen this constant tendency in either thought or life to move towards a polarized extreme of an undue conservatism and an undue liberalism. I don't need to go into that here, but you can see that very, very clearly. Of course, not only in terms of thought, but also in life. The intriguing thing for me as a European coming into, say, evangelical circles in the 70s, is that while many people, say, in the evangelical circles would put themselves in the conservative style in thought, in lifestyle, or in use of television, or in use of methods from the Harvard Business School, they're as uncritical and as liberal in the real sense of the word, and as worldly in any sense of the word, as the worst of the people on the other side. Because while they have very critically guarded defenses at certain points, so that many conservatives could smell a liberal theologian at 100 miles, so sensitive their noses, they don't develop the same critical antenna in terms of all sorts of other areas, and uncritically have adopted all sorts of things of the world. So I would say very simply, if you looked at evangelicalism 20 years ago, the problem was one of its faithfulness leading to isolation and sometimes to irrelevance. But that is not the going danger today. The problem is the other way around. But perhaps since 1800, there's been this tremendous pressure towards the polarization, and the rare times that individuals and churches and total Christian communities have kept that balance. That was very brief and inadequate. Let me just summarize what I think is the challenge of this. You could spell this out in a lot of areas, socio-political areas, and so on. But the root challenge is one that hits our discipleship as evangelical Christians. I see it like this. You can put it in two ways. One, will we break out of the constrictions of modernity? Two, if we do, will we avoid going the way the liberals went before? That's the simple challenge we face, put rather simplistically. Will we break out? There's undoubtedly this tremendous renewal, extraordinary opportunities. But many people are uncritically euphoric because they don't recognize the context, the constrictions. Most American sociologists would say that American conservative religion has gone from being historic, culture-changing force to being a folk religion. I'm not saying whether it has or not, but it's certainly going that way. The challenge of that is that there's no religion in world history which has ever gone from being a historic, cultural force to being a folk religion and gone backwards to regaining center stage. And the signs are that much of the opportunity, much of the vitality, much of the resources in 10 years' time will not have made much impact because people have not seen the confining constrictions of modernity on discipleship. And therefore, here's this first half of the challenge that comes out of this. Will we break out of this constriction of modernity and make Jesus as Lord count in every area? Secondly, if we do, will we avoid going the way the liberals went before? In other words, evangelicalism remained intact by being remote. As we engage, as the liberals did, their problem was in the negotiation of engagement, they became ensnared. In committing themselves to culture, they became compromised. And again, I'm not saying this as someone who's a fundamentalist, saying that certain evangelicals are becoming liberal. I'm saying this as someone who studied under a sociologist who's an atheist who says evangelicals are becoming liberal. Why? In the 1960s, under the impact of engaging with modernity over television, over business, over feminism, over you name it, people are evangelical in name and experience and tradition and so on. But the atheist sociologists are pointing out that the evangelical convictions are changing. Why? The impact of modernity is such that one tends to negotiate at one's peril. And I think this represents a tremendous challenge to those who love Christ and want to live faithful in this world. How do we break out of the constrictions and at the same time avoid refueling the liberal cycle all over again? In other words, remain that faithfulness to Christ being in the culture but not of the culture. Let me leave it there and throw it open for discussion.
Is this on? You used the term discipleship on several occasions. I take it that doesn't mean sitting in our living room with a little group of 4 or 5 navigators or our local church group. What do you mean by that phrase?
I mean a person who is prepared to make the Lordship of Christ something which touches every area of their life. For example, the verse I became a Christian under, Luke 5. Peter was prepared to listen to Jesus and his teaching, but when Jesus said, launch out in the deep and let down your nets on the other side and so on, you can almost hear from Peter, Lord, I'm the fisherman, you leave that to me. And his discovering the Lordship of Christ a few minutes later was his realization that Christ's Lordship was not just religious, it was over his fishing too, and he fell at Christ's feet. So by discipleship, I mean people who don't just say Jesus is Lord and practice that in personal, pietistic ways, but who in their business, professional areas really think Christianly and act Christianly over every area that their life touches and is involved in. Secularization, the basic issue is religious space. Put biblically, the issue is who is Lord. And so by discipleship, I mean, the practicing consequences of saying Jesus is Lord in our lives.
I appreciate your last two questions. I think we should ask ourselves, how do we break out of modernity, as you've described it? The second question, however, I wonder, i.e., how do we do that without becoming liberal again? Could that question be laid to rest for a while? It seems to me that question creates a defensiveness that inhibits our learning.
On the contrary, I think it'd be foolish to do so. We should certainly avoid the mistakes of the way it's been raised at certain times in the past. But I think in many of these problem areas, the best and most sane way to start is to anchor down both extremes of the problems. For instance, we have young evangelicals in England who are almost marching backwards in today's cultural involvement, fueling their justification for what they're doing by all the faults they can find in fundamentalism. And this is not only uncharitable, it's extremely short-sighted and plain stupid. And that's where I raised the question in terms of what atheists are pointing out, not in terms of what extreme sort of fundies attacking trendies type of thing is going on. So I think anchor down both extremes in the problem. And I personally am not into the question of naming names and denigrating people and so on, but just identifying problems and principles so that each of us, by God's grace, can avoid those and keep that balance. So in the present context, I think be naive to see that the going danger is not fundamentalism. The going danger in the 70s is liberalism. And I don't just mean in terms of theology, I mean in other areas. There are people who are using the Harvard Business School for their evangelism in ways that are absolutely naive and downright wrong. The Christian use of television and so on is incredibly uncritical. So I'm not referring to certain things that are often talked about in terms of the battles. But all over the place there is an uncritical involvement of things that are accepted in the world, and all of those are up for challenging assumptions.
In your first lecture, you referred to the responsibility of knowledge in this, giving broad strokes of some of the places in which we might apply it. I wish you could go in a little greater depth in terms of us as individuals, not a call to the church in general. We face 50 political, economic, religious issues to which we can apply our knowledge and to which we need to avoid the problems of modern consciousness. But how do we make a set of priorities? How do I know, do I write about laws concerning homosexuality? Do I write to the people about what's shown on TV? How do I set a set of priorities in which to be involved in? I face psychological overload. I can't do them all.
Yeah. I personally wonder if there'd been no fall, whether we would have lived in a mass society like today. In other words, I think some of the aspects of modernity are part of the unintended fallen consequences of man's creativity and so on. And modernity is creating a kind of overload that's almost impossible to live with. So there are no easy answers. This is just the way I live with it. As I see it, I didn't spell that out in any great depth, if you take the whole question of calling, who we are in our identity, how we express our gifts in terms of service and stewardship, calling gives us this absorption which allows us to do our part without being overloaded by the whole. But if you think of the parts that each of us are involved in, take, say, the question of the North-South dialogue or the Third World Economic Order and things like this, each of our callings will intersect with that problem in different ways. So, for instance, just down the road from me is a Christian economist in Oxford, one of the professors, who's thinking about this. Now, his calling as a professional economist is to deal with this on a profound theological level as well as to help Christians understand on an ordinary level. He has a very different calling to mine. My calling touches that in terms of, one, my lifestyle, two, my discussion with Christians, say, on campuses and things like this, as well as non-Christians, three, in terms of where I put my shoulder in voting, for example, in Britain, standing against the raising of tariffs to victimize the third world. But you see how, if you look at it in terms of calling, each of our callings will intersect at that problems in different ways. Now, if each Christian is fulfilling his calling, located in his context, so obviously you're more concerned with issues that hit you in Chicago than issues that hit people in Australia, and so on. So the calling gives a social location and a personal responsibility that focuses what would otherwise be an impossibly wide pressure. So we should be open to Christian leaders around the world, say Ron Sider saying, we haven't considered this. And we may need to bring into our sense of consciousness things we've ignored. But again, they'll be focused in what to us is that inner concentration of our life's calling. That's how I see it. Yeah.
You pointed out the shift from knowing.
Sorry?
You pointed out the shift from knowing to believing and to feeling. And I was hoping that you could give some suggestions on how to relate or encourage someone who is a Christian and has forsaken the faith, running that gamut to feeling because of an existential crisis, and who's bought wholeheartedly into Alan Watts.
Mm-hmm. There's usually a sort of transitional stage in people's lives when they've forsaken the faith for that reason. The first moment of their defection, as it were, is a moment when they've been let down, disappointed, saddened, and disillusioned. And if they're in that part of the transition, I mean before the shift, you can almost say, well, there is something deeper, there is something better, there is another way. You can understand why you believe what you believe. You can have a Christian mind, etc. So if you sense spiritually they're in that stage, just after defection, where they realize the problems and wish there was something better, you can come straight in with a positive answer. But then people very often go beyond that to where they pass from doubt to disbelief, and they find something else, and their disbelief hardens into rejection, cynicism, scorn, or whatever. At that stage, to introduce the positive is usually just washes off their back like water off a duck's back. You've almost got to do an apologetic in terms of pushing them out to see the problems of their new assumptions. And when they face those, then they're opened up to seeing, all right, there's a problem here. They don't have to go back to an unthinking gospel, but to something with genuine substance and truth and understanding under it. So as it were, spiritually discern where they are in terms of their moving across from faith to unbelief. And depending on what particular philosophy they're now into, you react that way. That's how I would see it.
This is just a twofold question. When you look at the effect that Wilberforce and Wesley had on England and the effect of the Second Great Awakening on America, it's just mind-boggling in terms of the social action that occurred and the effect on society. And yet in the last few generations, we've seen very little of that, and even recently with the Declaration of Social Concern, there's been a lot of rhetoric, but as you point out, there's been very little done. And I'm wondering whether the reason for that is the fact that we've kind of lost the optimism on man, the post-millennial optimism that there occurred in the 19th century, and the effect of the two world wars, and whether evangelicals have given up. And then the second part of that question is, how can we as evangelicals avoid having the lifeboat mentality of the ship is sinking, it can't be saved, let's save all we can and get on with it? How do we deal with that?
Gosh, there's so many things that sprout out from your questions. One would be, don't take the 19th century optimism at face value. For this reason, those who've analyzed it, supremely that sense that human beings can do it, in other words, men can change their institutions, where did it come from? From Wilberforce. In fact, most 19th century historians analyze so much of that, not the optimism itself, but that sense that human beings can change institutions in terms of social justice, relate the biggest impact of it all back to Wilberforce. Probably no one person in world history, through voluntary movements, has done so much. In other words, we still lived off the capital of that, which became secularized and so on, and then became a very vague, woolly optimism. But it was his obedience which saw that it must be done, and by God's grace it had to be done, and it was done, which gave the side effect of creating a tremendous sense of optimism that almost anything can be done. We're back actually to where we were when he started, which isn't a bad thing. Now, in terms of why we don't do it today, I'm not at all suggesting no one's doing anything. I thank God for all that you have got in this country. You've got many ways much more than we have in England. We've got a few things like, say, the Christian expression in the arts, which is perhaps better than you have over here, but in most areas, evangelicals are doing much more over here than in most parts of the world. So I'm not denying what's happening, but much more should be happening. I think the key thing is to analyze all the reasons why people aren't doing it. You know, there are all sorts of them. But what I do in the light of this is always try, say, in a student group on campus, to teach principles, such as discipleship and so on, and at the same time immediately stake down pressures which will make them deny it. So that in the very act of teaching, you're creating the tension that discipleship needs. Far too much principle becomes platitudinous because there's no pressures identified which create that tension and dissonance. I'd say this because sociologists point out that where you have correct doctrine preached in a vacuum, it just becomes a rationalization of the status quo. But where doctrine is in tension with diagnosis, something happens, because what God says should be is in tension with what now is, and the church knows what it's got to do. The root meaning of faith is actually taught, and Christians are actually stretched on the line doing it. So, blessed are the poor in spirit. What in the American culture antithetically denies being poor in spirit? Identify 10 or 12 things, and many Christians are falling for them. So every time there's a positive principle, bring in the negative pressure, set up the tension, and challenge Christians to go out. When you do this, you can see all sorts. For instance, just a few days in the campuses in America, and something very striking compared with Europe. There's not the same critical thinking power. Bright students, idealistic students, but the whole critical thinking is lacking. Probably for all sorts of reasons, but when you identify them, you can help people over it. For instance, the desire for easy answers. So much just packaged, and you almost get people wanting today a sort of 6-pack of cassettes for how to do everything. And the how-to mentality, the can-do publishing is just crippling so much of American thinking at that popular level. So I would identify these sorts of problems which are stopping genuine biblical discipleship, teach the principles, set up the pressure and tension so it looks almost impossible to them, and then by God's grace they'll do it. This is the sort of way I go about it.
This may be a very uncritical question, but it would be a practical one. A few moments ago, you talked about the businessman who had let some of the Christian philosophy or ideas impact his family and his business conduct, and yet, if I understood you, you considered him a deficient disciple. And I wondered if you would expand on that and perhaps show how he should allow all of biblical teaching to impact his life.
Now, I couldn't answer the second one fully. Partly for 2 reasons. Partly because, one, no Christian today has figured that out. And the other reason, it isn't my calling. But I can see the principle and the vision. For instance, I said that in Detroit not long ago, and someone immediately got up and denied it. And another person got up and said, no, I would support that, and I work at top levels in General Motors. And that's what I do see in Christians. They come in this personal way. Now compare this with Wilberforce. He wasn't out of a Christian background. But he suddenly saw that if Jesus was Lord, it would touch, as he wrote in his diary, 2 things: English moral values and the slave institutions. And he saw the implications of the Lordship of Christ right down into the economic consequences and so on of slavery. And he fought it for all he was worth. But you don't get that holistic sense of thinking through, say, business Christianly, the way what I do affects the workers, the way what we do here in America affects the third world, or whatever. Now, a lot of people, having not thought, jump to equally simplistic conclusions on the other side, and from having no frame of reference, jump to having an alien frame of reference that's neo-Marxist or whatever. And I don't mean that that's good either. But the challenge is to really think holistically. Wherever our lives touch, are we doctors, nurses, teachers, theologians, pastors, executives, or whatever, wherever our lives touch and our influence flows, and we've got to figure it out what it is, we've got to see what the Christian implications are. And I think this implies things like a Christian framework of thought. It implies a core group of fellowship which not only supports but stimulates. And today so many of the small groups only support. They don't press people and help them. Say, if you were with me and you met every week with me in the group we have in Oxford, would you be helpful in tooling me to be a better Christian freelance writer? So the implications, Christianly speaking, of where my writing or speaking goes, you would help me to see and force me to face and so on. And I would do the same to you. Do we have those sort of core groups? So all this involves a framework, it involves a Christian core group of discussion and so on. Supremely, it involves a particular theology. But that's the sort of thing I mean. Okay, now, people like Ron Sider are beginning to figure this out today. In other words, the other thing I missed out is people who are in business should plug themselves into an ongoing discussion of that area. People who are Christian lawyers, the Christian Legal Society, or whatever. Because the discussion's better than it was 10 years ago. Hopefully in 10 years it'll be much better still. But it started, it's improving, we've got to join in it.
I would only want to be sure that we did not condemn a man who held a position within a corporation in which his form may have connotations which could be viewed in a different perspective, and that is his position may simply be or maybe substantially, his involvement in society, and not just a form, not just a position or a title. He's not simply fulfilling a role, although he may be, but this represents perhaps a greater involvement and commitment than other people who perhaps are taking the route of radical discipleship and refusing that responsibility that he may be assuming.
Well, I think a lot of what passes for radical discipleship is just a cop-out in theological language. I really do. And I think there's a kind of purist ideology of more disaffection from the church that is just criticism without any realism. And so I'm not, what I was saying shouldn't lead to that.
Yes, okay, that's what I wanted to be sure. And if
so I wasn't condemning that man, but just making the comment that the influence is largely private. Now, there are many people whose influence cannot be more because of the level at which they work. Then for them the question comes, one, is the work worthwhile, or could they use that same gift equally involved but in a more worthwhile thing? For instance, I was talking to a very fine person in the Chicago area who was in Oxford, who pointed out he changed his job from one factory that made tractors to another factory that made tractors, because the second one, the same level of involvement and so on, but the second one was more worthwhile in making tractors that were more useful, in this case for the third world. So the question, is it worthwhile, is very important, and there are different levels of involvement there. The other question is it wrong? And many Christians, because they cannot do much, finally support institutions that are ultimately wrong, and because they can't do much, they don't think too deeply. But I'm certainly not fueling the dropout reaction too. That's equally unrealistic. Yeah. Okay, one more.
Okay. You said at the first of your talk that don't ask a fish about water. Here at seminary we have discussion with other students and stuff, but how can a pastor immersed in a local church avoid becoming like a fish in water and not seeing the society around him?
Mm-hmm. I didn't say that. It was the Chinese who said that. It makes the point for us, but obviously today you've got to set up all the counter-environments, put in that language, that one can. Supremely, the Word and the Spirit. But of course we even read them with our cultural spectacles, etc. So in this world, there's no final escape and no absolute escape from contextualization and its short-sightedness and worldliness. But I think the very expectations we have from the Word of God, one. Two, from history. Completely different worldviews asking us questions and forcing us to see the differences. Three, other cultures. People, every young American who has the time should spend at least 6 months in another culture at a different economic level to be forced to see what's good about America he never saw before, what's bad about America he never saw before, and so on. And one does this by travel, by reading, and so on, to be forced to see differences and therefore to think more deeply about one's own position.